What happens when a single, thoughtless second of courage rips the veil from the world you thought you knew? What happens when the life you lived, a quiet tapestry of exhaustion and unpaid bills, is incinerated in the flash of a gunshot, revealing a destiny written in blood and moonlight that you were never meant to discover? For Lena, a waitress whose greatest ambition was making it to the end of a double shift with her sanity intact, that single second was everything. She was nobody, a ghost moving between tables in a city that had a million ghosts just like her, serving food to people whose names she would never know. He was somebody, a man whose presence filled the grand ballroom with an invisible pressure, a silent command that drew all eyes. She didn't know he was a king, let alone the alpha king of a hidden nation of werewolves. She only saw a man in the path of a bullet. In that sliver of time, instinct, an instinct she never knew she possessed, took over. She moved, a blur of black uniform and desperate resolve, throwing her own fragile body in front of his powerful frame. She felt the searing, impossible pain, heard the gasp of 1,000 wealthy patrons, and saw the king's eyes, a startling, inhuman shade of silver, widen in shock before her world dissolved into a silent, screaming darkness. This is the story of how an ordinary woman's death became the birth of a legend, how a king's gratitude became a protector's fury, and how the secrets buried in a forgotten bloodline rose to challenge an empire. The bullet was not an end, it was a brutal, bloody beginning, pulling a waitress from the shadows and thrusting her onto a throne of danger, power, and an impossible, fated love. Her name was Lena, and her real life began the moment it was supposed to be over. The polished marble floor of the Grand Astoria ballroom reflected the crystal chandeliers like a frozen lake, 1,000 points of fractured light, shimmering under the weight of polite conversation and the clinking of champagne flutes. Lena moved through the glittering crowd, a silent phantom in her crisp black and white uniform, her tray a silver shield against the casual condescension of the city's elite. She was adept at becoming invisible, a skill honed over years of serving people, who looked through her as if she were made of glass. Her feet ached, a low, familiar thrum that had become the soundtrack to her life, but she ignored it, focusing on the rhythm of her work. Circle the room, collect the empty glasses, offer a fresh flute, repeat. It was a mechanical ballet of servitude, and she was its most practiced dancer. The air in the ballroom was thick with expensive perfume and the low hum of power, but tonight something else coiled beneath it, a tension sharp and metallic, like the taste of ozone before a lightning strike. Lena felt it in her bones, a primal unease that made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. She dismissed it as fatigue. A double shift in a room this crowded could make anyone jittery. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on the guest of honor. She didn't know his name, only that the entire event, a fundraiser for some international conservation effort, revolved around him. He stood near the towering arched windows, a monolith of a man in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. He wasn't speaking, merely listening to a fawning politician, but he commanded the space around him with an unnerving stillness. His presence was a gravitational pull, bending the light and sound of the room toward him. His eyes, a shade of pale, piercing silver, swept the crowd with an unnerving intensity, as if he were cataloging every threat, every shadow. For a moment, his gaze met hers from across the room, and Lena felt a jolt, a shocking current of recognition that made no sense. It was as if a dormant part of her own soul had just been awakened by a distant call. She quickly looked away, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was foolish. He was a client, a wealthy patron. She was the help. That was the beginning and the end of it. The feeling lingered, though, a low thrum of warning that resonated with the strange tension in the air. She saw it then, a flicker of movement on the second-floor balcony that overlooked the main hall. A man, not a guest, dressed in the dark gray uniform of the hotel staff. But he wasn't carrying a tray. He was lifting something small and black, something that glinted with a cold, final purpose. A gun. Time seemed to warp, stretching and slowing until each second was an eternity. The world became a series of distinct, hyper-focused images. The glint of the silencer, the indifferent faces of the crowd, the silver-eyed man turning his head as if sensing the danger a moment too late. There was no thought, no decision. There was only a primal, undeniable command that erupted from the deepest well of her being. Protect him. Before her mind could process the absurdity of the impulse, her body was already in motion. She dropped her tray, the champagne flutes shattering on the marble, with a sound that was both deafening and utterly lost in the cavernous room. She ran, 3 steps, 4, a desperate, impossible sprint, across the polished floor. She saw the flash from the balcony, a tiny star of death. She heard the soft, cough-like sound of the suppressed shot. She reached the man just as he turned fully toward the threat. His eyes wide not with fear, but with a dawning, furious understanding. She launched herself forward, her shoulder colliding with his chest, pushing him back, away, out of the path. And then the fire. A white-hot, tearing agony erupted in her back, stealing her breath, her strength, her consciousness. The force of the impact threw her against him, and for a fleeting instant she was held in his arms, her head against the solid wall of his chest. She smelled something wild and clean, like a forest after a storm, a scent that was both alien and deeply familiar. She looked up, into those silver eyes now swirling with a tempest of disbelief and a terrifying ancient rage. The noise of the ballroom finally broke its spell, erupting into a cacophony of screams. But Lena heard nothing. The world was narrowing to a single point of light. His face. A low growl, a sound that was not human, rumbled from his chest, a vibration she felt in her very soul. Then the darkness that had been clinging to the edges of her vision rushed in, swallowing everything in a silent, final wave. Her last thought was not of fear or pain, or the life she was leaving behind. It was the echo of that single, inexplicable command that had driven her to her death: protect the Alpha. The word meant nothing to her, and yet, in the abyss, it felt like the only truth she had ever known. The first sensation was warmth, a gentle, pervasive heat that seemed to seep into her bones, chasing away a profound and lingering chill. It was followed by the scent of antiseptic, clean and sharp, layered over something deeper, muskier, the smell of rain-soaked earth and wild herbs. Lena's eyelids were heavy, stitched together by a thick, syrupy exhaustion. She fought against it, a flicker of panic igniting in her chest as memory returned in a brutal, searing flash. The shattered glass, the silent gunshot, the impossible, fiery pain in her back. She should be dead. The thought was not a question, but a certainty. She had felt the life draining out of her, had seen the world fade to black. Yet here she was, conscious, warm, and breathing. She forced her eyes open, blinking against a soft golden light. She was not in a hospital. The room was vast, the ceiling a high arch of dark, polished wood, from which a simple iron chandelier hung. The walls were stone, softened by rich tapestries depicting sprawling forests and wolves running under a full moon. She was lying in a bed so large it felt like its own continent, covered by a heavy fur blanket that was the source of the comforting warmth. A fire crackled in a massive hearth across the room, its flames dancing and casting long flickering shadows. Panic began to claw its way up her throat. Where was she? Who had brought her here? She tried to sit up, a gasp escaping her lips, as she braced for the agony she knew must be waiting. But there was nothing, no pain, not even a twinge of soreness. Her hand flew to her back, her fingers probing the spot where the bullet had torn through her flesh. She felt only smooth, unbroken skin beneath the thin fabric of a silk nightgown that was most certainly not hers. It was impossible. A wound like that, it didn't just vanish. I would not recommend moving too quickly. The voice was deep, a low baritone that resonated through the quiet room, seeming to vibrate in the very air around her. Lena's head snapped toward the sound. The man from the gala, the silver-eyed king, was sitting in a heavy leather armchair near the fire, watching her. He was no longer in a tuxedo. He wore simple, black trousers and a dark gray Henley that stretched across his broad chest, the sleeves pushed up to his elbows, revealing powerful forearms. The casual attire did nothing to diminish the overwhelming aura of authority that clung to him. If anything, it amplified it, stripping away the veneer of civilization and revealing the raw, predatory power beneath. His silver eyes were fixed on her, their expression unreadable but intense, as if he were trying to see straight into her soul. "Who are you?" Lena's voice was a hoarse whisper. "Where am I?" "My name is Kyle," he said, his voice calm, yet carrying that same undercurrent of command. "And you are in my home. You are safe here." Safe? She had been shot. She had woken up in a strange place, with a strange man who watched her with the focused intensity of a wolf. Nothing about this felt safe. "How am I—" She couldn't finish the sentence. How was she alive? How was she healed? "You were grievously wounded," he stated, his gaze never wavering. "My personal physician attended to you." "No physician can heal a gunshot wound in—" She trailed off, realizing she had no idea how much time had passed. "Hours," she guessed. "It has been less than a day," he confirmed, a faint, almost imperceptible hint of something, awe, confusion, in his tone. "Your recovery has been remarkable." Remarkable wasn't the word. It was a miracle, a terrifying, inexplicable miracle. Lena pushed herself up, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. The silk of the nightgown felt alien against her skin. She needed her clothes, her uniform, the familiar worn fabric of her own life. She needed to get out of here. "I want to go home," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. Kyle rose from his chair in a single fluid motion. He was even larger than she'd realized, tall and broad-shouldered, a physical embodiment of power. He took a step toward her, and she flinched back instinctively. He stopped immediately, holding up a hand in a gesture of peace. "I cannot allow that," he said, his voice softening slightly, though the command remained. "Not yet. The man who shot at me is still at large. You are not safe beyond these walls." "The man who shot at you," Lena repeated, the words tasting like ash. He shot me. I took a bullet for you. Why? The question hung in the air between them. Why had she done it? She had no answer. It was an instinct she couldn't explain, a compulsion that had overridden every rational thought. Kyle's expression shifted, the hard lines of his face softening with something that looked like gratitude. Deep, profound gratitude. That is a question I have been asking myself since the moment you fell, he admitted. You, a human, threw yourself in front of a weapon you could not possibly survive. For a stranger. He took another slow step forward. But that is the crux of the matter, isn't it? You are not just a human, Lena. A cold dread washed over her. What are you talking about? Of course I'm human. He shook his head slowly. A human would be dead. A human would not have healed from such a wound in a matter of hours. The bullet was silver, designed to kill my kind. It should have been instantly fatal to one of us. And yet for you, it triggered something. It awakened what was dormant inside you. His words made no sense, a jumble of nonsense that her panicked mind refused to assemble into a coherent thought. His kind? One of us? I don't understand, she whispered, her hands clutching the fur blanket. You will, he promised. The world you knew is a veil drawn over the truth. You ripped a hole in that veil tonight. I am the alpha king of the lichen packs of this continent, and you, Lena, are one of us. He said the words with such absolute certainty that for a terrifying moment she almost believed him. Werewolves. It was the stuff of fantasy, of late-night horror movies. Not something that existed in the world of double shifts and lukewarm coffee. And yet, the impossible healing, the strange sense of recognition when she'd first seen him, the primal urge to protect him. It was all insane. It had to be. She was losing her mind. She shook her head, a tear of sheer, overwhelming confusion and fear tracing a path down her cheek. No, she said, her voice cracking. No, you're wrong. Kyle's expression was filled with a strange, aching sympathy. He closed the remaining distance between them, kneeling before her so their eyes were level. The sheer power radiating from him was dizzying, but his movements were gentle, deliberate. I know this is difficult to accept, he said softly, his silver eyes holding hers. Your life has been built upon a lie meant to protect you, but the truth is in your blood. It's in the way you healed. It's in the instinct that made you save your alpha. You are not human, Lena. You are home. The word home echoed in the cavernous room, a concept so alien in this context that it bordered on cruel. Home was her tiny third-floor walk-up apartment that always smelled faintly of her downstairs neighbor's cooking. Home was the worn-out armchair where she read paperback novels until her eyes burned. It was not this place of stone and shadow, of furs and impossible truths spoken by a man who called himself a king. You're crazy, Lena breathed, pulling back from him, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Or I am. This can't be real. She looked wildly around the room, searching for an anchor, something that made sense. The flickering fire, the woven wolves on the tapestries, the sheer impossible scale of the furniture, it all felt like a fever dream. Kyle remained kneeling, his patience a tangible force in the room. He did not seem offended by her disbelief. He seemed to expect it. What if I could show you? He asked, his voice a low, persuasive rumble. Proof, something your rational mind cannot deny. Lena stared at him, torn between the desperate urge to flee and a terrifying magnetic curiosity. A part of her, a deep, instinctual part she was only just beginning to recognize, was not afraid of him. It was drawn to him, calmed by his presence. It was the sensible, human part of her that was screaming. "What kind of proof?" she whispered, the words barely audible. He rose to his feet, his immense height once again dominating the space. He gestured toward the large, arched windows that overlooked a moonlit courtyard. "Come," he said simply. Hesitantly, Lena stood, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. The silk nightgown offered no protection against the sudden chill she felt, a fear that was bone deep. She followed him to the window, her bare feet silent on the cold stone floor. Outside, a meticulously kept garden lay sleeping under the pale light of a waning moon. Stone paths wound through manicured hedges and dormant rose bushes. It was beautiful, peaceful, and utterly at odds with the turmoil raging inside her. Kyle stood beside her, not touching, but his proximity was a palpable weight, a field of energy that made her skin tingle. "Watch," he commanded softly. Lena kept her eyes on him, her breath catching in her throat. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a subtle change began. The air around him seemed to shimmer, to thicken. A low growl rumbled in his chest, deeper and more guttural than before. His shoulders broadened, his powerful frame seeming to expand, to swell with a contained, violent energy. She saw the first real, undeniable change in his eyes. The silver irises began to glow with an inner light, the pupils elongating into something distinctly non-human. His features started to shift, to lengthen, the clean lines of his jaw and nose becoming coarser, more feral. The sound of his bones, a sickening series of cracks and pops, filled the silence. Lena stumbled back, a strangled cry catching in her throat, her hand flying to her mouth. It was horrifying, it was impossible, yet it was happening. Fur, thick and black as night, sprouted from his skin, covering his arms, his face, his neck. His body contorted, breaking and reforming into a new, terrifying shape. In seconds, the man was gone. In his place stood a creature of nightmare and legend, a wolf, but it was no ordinary wolf. It was immense, its shoulders level, with her waist, its head massive. Its fur was the color of polished jet, and its eyes, now fully transformed, were two pools of molten silver that burned with a fierce, ancient intelligence. It looked at her, and she knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that it was Kale. He was watching her, gauging her reaction. The creature took a soft step forward, its huge paws silent on the stone. Lena didn't scream. The sound was trapped in her lungs, frozen by a terror so profound it transcended noise. But beneath the terror, something else stirred, awe, and a strange, horrifying flicker of recognition. As she stared at the great wolf, a memory, fragmented and dreamlike, surfaced from the depths of her mind. It was a memory from childhood, one she had long since buried, convinced it was a nightmare. She was 6 years old, playing near the woods behind her house. She'd fallen from a tree, a nasty, bone-jarring fall that had left her with a deep gash on her leg, the bone shockingly white against the crimson blood. She had cried, not just from the pain, but from a strange, buzzing energy that filled her body. Her parents had rushed to her side, their faces masks of panic. But it wasn't just concern in their eyes, it was fear. Her father had scooped her up, and her mother had pressed a cloth to the wound, her hands trembling. Later that night, tucked in bed, Lena had peeled back the bandage. The gash, which should have required dozens of stitches, was gone. In its place was a thin, silvery scar that was already fading, the skin beneath it smooth and whole. She remembered her parents' whispered frantic argument later that night, words she hadn't understood then. "It's happening too soon. They'll find her. We have to suppress it, keep her safe." The next day they had moved, abruptly leaving their home and friends behind. It was the first of many moves, a pattern of dislocation that had defined her childhood. They had always told her it was for her father's work. Now, staring at the silver-eyed wolf, she understood. They weren't running for a job. They were running from this, from what she was. The wolf, Kale, seemed to sense the shift in her. He lowered his massive head and let out a soft whine, a sound so unexpectedly gentle and plaintive that it broke the spell of her fear. He was not a monster. He was the man who had sat by her bedside, the king who had offered her safety. He was her kind. The realization washed over her not with terror, but with a sudden, gut-wrenching sense of loss. Her entire life, the identity she had so carefully constructed, was a lie. Her parents had lied to her, not out of malice, but out of a fear she was only now beginning to comprehend. They were protecting her from a world she was born into, a world of power, of danger, of literal monsters. She began, her voice trembling. "I remember." The wolf's silver eyes softened. He took another step, then another, until he was standing directly in front of her. He was so close, she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the wild, clean scent of his fur. He nudged her hand with his wet nose, a gesture of profound comfort and reassurance. And in that moment, Lena did something her conscious mind would have deemed insane. She reached out a trembling hand and laid it on his head, her fingers sinking into the thick, soft fur between his ears. A current, a jolt of pure energy passed between them. It was a connection, a sense of belonging so powerful it made her knees weak. It felt like coming home. The life Lena had known was a flimsy shack, built on a foundation of lies, and Kyle's revelation was the earthquake that had brought it all crashing down. In the days that followed, she lived in a state of suspended disbelief, wandering the halls of his vast, fortress-like home, which he called the Citadel. It was less a house and more a self-contained kingdom, carved into the side of a mountain overlooking the city, hidden from human eyes by methods Kale vaguely described as ancient and powerful. She was an honored guest, a prisoner, a patient, and a student all at once. Kyle's pack members, the few she was allowed to see, treated her with a baffling mixture of reverence and suspicion. They moved with a predatory grace, their eyes holding a feral intelligence that was deeply unsettling. They spoke to her in respectful tones, calling her the Alpha's charge, but their gazes lingered, their nostrils flaring as they tried to catch her scent, to decipher the mystery of the human who had impossibly healed from a silver wound. Her most frequent companion, besides Kale himself, was his beta, Elias. He was older than Kale, his dark hair streaked with gray at the temples, his face a roadmap of old scars and quiet wisdom. Where Kale was a storm of raw power and authority, Elias was the calm, steady earth. He answered her endless questions with unnerving patience, explaining the intricacies of their society, the hierarchy of the packs, the sacred laws that governed their existence, and the ever-present threat of rivals who sought to usurp Kale's throne as Alpha King. It was Elias who confirmed that the assassination attempt was not a random act of violence, but a calculated move by a rival alpha named Marcus, a notoriously ruthless leader who believed Kale's attempts to foster a fragile peace with the human world were a sign of weakness. Marcus wanted a war. He wanted to reclaim the night, to let the wolf run free without restraint. And Kale, with his progressive ideals, was in his way. Lena was the unexpected complication, the wrench in Marcus's meticulously planned coup. But it was in the Citadel that she also met the sharpest, most immediate threat to her fragile peace of mind, a she-wolf named Serafina. Serafina was beautiful in a way that was both breathtaking and dangerous, like a perfectly forged blade. She had hair the color of spun gold and eyes the vibrant green of a forest canopy. She carried herself with the arrogant grace of a queen, and it was clear from the moment they met that she viewed Lena not as a guest, but as an infestation. Their first encounter was in the Citadel's sprawling library, a circular room lined with floor-to-ceiling shelves of ancient books. Lena had been tracing the spine of a leather-bound volume when Serafina entered, her presence sucking the warmth from the air. "So this is the little human stray the Alpha brought home," Serafina purred, her voice a silken, condescending drawl. She circled Lena slowly, like a predator inspecting its prey. "I must admit, I don't see the appeal. You smell of city smog and weakness." Lena's spine stiffened. She had spent her life being invisible, of being looked down upon, but this was different. This was a targeted, deliberate venom. "My name is Lena," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Serafina laughed, a short, sharp sound devoid of humor. "A name is irrelevant when your blood is thin. Tell me, little stray, how does it feel to be a pet? Does he have you sleeping at the foot of his bed?" The insult was designed to sting, to humiliate. A hot flush of anger, surprisingly potent, rose in Lena's chest. Before she could form a reply, Kale's voice cut through the tension like a whip crack. "Serafina." He had entered the library silently, his silver eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. The sheer force of his authority slammed into the room, and Serafina, for all her arrogance, visibly flinched, her haughty demeanor faltering. "Alpha," she said, her tone shifting to one of cloying sweetness as she turned to him. "I was just getting acquainted with your guest." "Lena is under my personal protection," Kale stated, his voice dangerously low. He walked to Lena's side, placing a hand lightly on her shoulder. The gesture was possessive, final, a clear and public declaration. She will be shown the respect that entails. Any insult to her is an insult to me. Is that understood? Serafina's green eyes flashed with fury, a flicker of raw hatred directed not at Kale, but at Lena. The smile on her face was brittle. "Of course, Alpha, my apologies." She inclined her head in a shallow bow and swept from the room, her fury a palpable wake behind her. The silence she left was heavy. Lena could feel the warmth of Kale's hand through her shirt, a steady, grounding pressure. "She hates me," Lena said, the words a simple statement of fact. "Serafina has long believed she is destined to be my mate, the queen of this pack," Kyle explained, his voice losing its hard edge. He didn't remove his hand. "Your presence here and the circumstances of your arrival have disrupted her ambitions." He turned to face her, his silver eyes searching hers. "You are not a stray or a pet. You are a miracle, Lena, a mystery I intend to solve. And I will not allow anyone, least of all her, to make you feel otherwise." His words were a balm on the wound Serafina had tried to inflict. But they also highlighted her precarious position. She was a miracle, a mystery, an object of fascination and protection. She was not, however, one of them. Not yet. She still felt like an outsider looking in. A human girl playing dress-up in a world of wolves. That feeling of otherness, of being caught between two worlds and belonging to neither, was a constant, gnawing ache. She was grateful for Kyle's protection, drawn to his strength, but she was also terrified. The dormant part of her that he claimed existed, the wolf in her blood, remained silent. She couldn't feel it. She couldn't access it. Until she did, she was just Lena, the waitress, and in a world of predators, that was the most dangerous thing she could possibly be. She knew with a chilling certainty that she had to find a way to awaken the power he saw in her, not just for her own survival, but to prove that the king who had staked his reputation on her was not a fool. The decision was made not in a grand council, but in the quiet resolve that settled in Lena's heart. She could not remain a protected liability. If this was her world now, she had to learn its language, and its language was power. She approached Kale with her request, finding him in the armory, a cavernous stone chamber filled with the glint of steel and the scent of oil and whetstones. He was inspecting the edge of a massive broadsword, the muscles in his back and shoulders shifting under his shirt with practiced ease. He looked up as she entered, his silver eyes immediately finding hers. "I need to learn," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the large room. She didn't need to elaborate. He knew exactly what she meant. A slow, approving smile touched his lips. "I was waiting for you to ask," he replied, setting the sword aside. "Elias will be your instructor. He is the most patient and the most skilled warrior I have ever known." He paused, his expression growing serious. "But be warned, Lena, the training will be grueling. It will push you past every limit you thought you had. The goal is not just to teach you how to fight, it is to force the part of you that is sleeping to awaken. Stress, exhaustion, fear, these are the keys that will unlock your potential." He was not wrong. Her training with Elias began the next day, at dawn in a secluded outdoor arena, a circle of packed earth surrounded by ancient, silent pines. The air was crisp and cold, her breath pluming in front of her. Elias was relentless. He started with the basics: endurance, strength, balance. He had her run until her lungs burned and her legs felt like lead, spar with her until her muscles screamed in protest, and practice forms until her body moved with a grace and precision she never knew it possessed. Days bled into weeks. Lena's body, once accustomed to the weary ache of a long shift, was being reforged in a crucible of pain and effort. She grew stronger, faster. The city softness was stripped away, replaced by lean, hard muscle. But the wolf remained dormant. Her senses were still frustratingly human. She could not hear the whisper of the wind through the pines the way Elias could, or smell the distant approach of a deer. The frustration was a constant, bitter companion. "Patience," Elias would say, in his calm, steady voice, whenever he saw the despair on her face. "The river does not carve the canyon in a day. You are fighting a lifetime of suppression. It will not yield easily." One afternoon, during a particularly intense sparring session, her frustration boiled over. Elias disarmed her for the 10th time, her wooden practice sword clattering to the ground. He moved with an effortless fluidity that seemed impossible for a man his size. She was exhausted, bruised, and felt the sting of tears threatening behind her eyes. "I can't do this," she yelled, her voice raw with emotion. "It's not working. There's nothing in me. Kale was wrong." Elias simply stood there, his expression unreadable. "He is never wrong about matters of blood and instinct," he said calmly. "The failure is not in you, Lena. It is in your approach. You are still thinking like a human. You fight with your mind, with technique. You have forgotten how to fight with your soul." "What is that supposed to mean?" she snapped, swiping at her sweaty brow. "It means you hold back," he said, his voice dropping, becoming more intense. "You are afraid of what is inside you. You are afraid to let go, to lose control. But the wolf cannot be controlled. It can only be embraced. So stop thinking, stop trying, and for once in your life, just feel." He lunged. It was not a training move. It was faster, more aggressive than anything he had done before. He didn't aim to disarm her. He aimed for her. Lena reacted on pure instinct. She dodged, stumbling back, her heart slamming against her ribs. He came at her again, a blur of motion, the wind from his passage whistling past her ear. Fear, sharp and primal, spiked through her. He was not Elias, her patient teacher. He was a predator, and she was his prey. He cornered her against the edge of the arena, his arm swinging in a powerful arc that would have shattered her ribs. There was no time to think, no time for technique. There was only time to react. She closed her eyes and screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror and rage. And then something broke loose inside her. It was like a dam bursting, a flood of raw, untamed energy surging through her veins. A heat, fierce and wild, exploded in her chest, spreading through her limbs like fire. A guttural growl ripped from her throat. A sound she had never made, a sound that was not entirely human. She opened her eyes. The world was different, sharper, brighter. The scent of pine and damp earth was so overwhelming, it was almost dizzying. She could hear the frantic beat of Elias's heart, the rustle of a squirrel in a tree 100 yards away. And when she looked at her hands, she saw the nails had elongated, thickening into sharp black claws. She looked up at Elias, who had frozen mid-strike, his eyes wide with shock and triumph. Her own reflection stared back at her from the polished surface of his irises. And her eyes were no longer the simple brown she had known her entire life. They were blazing, incandescent gold. The power thrumming through her was intoxicating, terrifying. She felt an urge to attack, to lash out, to revel in this newfound strength. But then she saw Elias's face, the genuine pride in his expression, and the red haze of her rage began to recede. The claws retracted, the golden light in her eyes dimmed, and the overwhelming sensory input faded back to normal levels. She was left panting, trembling, not from fear, but from the aftershocks of the power she had just unleashed. "There you are," Elias said, a rare, wide smile spreading across his face. "We were beginning to wonder when you would show up." Lena stared at her hands, which were once again her own. The wolf was real. It was in her. It was her. The fear was still there, but now it was mingled with a profound, exhilarating sense of wonder. She had not just found a weapon or a new skill. She had found a missing piece of her own soul. The news of Lena's partial shift spread through the citadel like wildfire. It changed everything. The whispers that had followed her down corridors turned from suspicion to awe. She was no longer just the Alpha's human project. She was a nascent power, an unknown quantity, one of their own. The shift in attitude was most palpable in the way the other pack members now met her gaze. They no longer looked through her, they looked at her with a newfound respect, their heads often tilting in a subtle gesture of deference. Seraphina's reaction, however, was far from respectful. The news only seemed to curdle her disdain into a more potent, volatile hatred. She saw Lena not as a miracle, but as a usurper, a low-born creature of unknown lineage, who had stolen the Alpha's attention and now the pack's admiration. The golden eyes, a trait no one in the Citadel had ever seen, became a particular point of obsession for her. It was an anomaly, an impurity in the bloodline, and she missed no opportunity to voice her disgust. But Lena had little time to dwell on Seraphina's animosity. Her world had become a whirlwind of training and discovery. Now that the connection to her wolf was forged, Elias's lessons intensified. He taught her how to tap into her heightened senses at will, to track by scent, to hear the subtlest of sounds, to move with the silence and speed of a predator. She learned that the golden eyes were a manifestation of her wolf's power, flaring to life when her emotions ran high or when she drew upon her nascent strength. The full transformation still eluded her, a barrier in her mind she could not yet break, but the power was there, a coiled spring of energy waiting just beneath her skin. Kyle watched her progress from a distance, his presence a constant, reassuring weight at the edge of her awareness. He gave her space to learn and grow, but his protective gaze never left her. The bond between them deepened, an unspoken understanding that transcended words. It was in the way he would appear at her side at the end of a grueling training day, a warm cloak in hand, or the way his eyes would soften when he watched her successfully master a new technique. One evening, as the first snow of winter began to dust the mountain tops, a formal summons arrived at the Citadel. It was delivered by a grim-faced envoy from a neutral territory, the parchment sealed with the dire wolf crest of Alpha Marcus. Kyle read the message in his study, a vast room dominated by a fireplace large enough to stand in and a desk carved from a single massive oak tree. Lena stood by the window, watching the snowflakes drift down, the silence in the room growing heavier with each passing second. Finally, Kyle looked up from the parchment, his face grim, his silver eyes like chips of ice. "Marcus has called for a conclave of the Alphas," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "He is formally challenging my rule." Elias, who had been standing sentinel by the door, swore under his breath. "On what grounds?" "The usual," Kyle said, his lip curling in a sneer. "He claims my leadership is weak, that my vision of coexistence with humans is a betrayal of our nature. He cites the assassination attempt as proof of my carelessness." He tossed the parchment onto the desk. "And he names you, Lena, as the primary source of my corruption. A human pet, he calls you, a distraction that has made me unfit to be king." The words were like a physical blow. Lena turned from the window, her hands clenched into fists. She was the weapon he was using against Kyle. Her very existence was being twisted into a justification for war. "It's a trap," Elias stated, his voice tight. "He'll have spent months securing alliances, poisoning the other Alphas against you. He will use the conclave to publicly shame you and force a vote for your removal." "I am aware," Kyle said, his gaze fixed on Lena. "But to refuse the summons is to admit guilt, to show fear. It would be an abdication. I have no choice but to attend." A cold dread settled in Lena's stomach. "He will try to kill you," she whispered. "He will try," Kyle agreed, "but this time he will not find me unprepared." He rose from his desk and walked toward her, stopping just before her. He looked down at her, his expression a mixture of grim determination and something else, something softer. "And you are coming with me." Lena's head snapped up. "Me? But I'm the reason he's doing this. My presence will only give him more ammunition." "Your presence is the only weapon that matters," Kyle countered, his intensity making the air crackle. "He calls you a weak human pet. He has built his entire challenge on that lie. He expects me to hide you, to be ashamed of you. I will do the opposite. I will put you on display. I will show the alphas not a human, but a survivor, a warrior, a miracle with eyes of gold that none of them can explain." He reached out, his hand gently cupping her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. The gesture was surprisingly tender. "He thinks you are my weakness, Lena. I will prove to them all that you are my greatest strength." The trust in his eyes was absolute, a heavy, precious weight. He was staking his crown, his life on her. The terrified waitress who had stumbled into his world just a few weeks ago was gone. In her place was someone who had faced down her fear, who had tasted her own power. She would not let him down. She would not let Marcus use her to destroy the man who had saved her, who had shown her who she truly was. "What do I have to do?" she asked, her voice steady, resolute. A fierce, predatory smile touched Cale's lips. "You will do nothing," he said, "but be exactly who you are. And when the time is right, you will show them. You will show them all." The conclave was not just a political maneuver. It was a declaration of war. And Lena, the girl with the golden eyes, was to be its epicenter. The journey to the neutral territory of Silverwood, where the conclave was to be held, was a tense, silent affair. They traveled in a convoy of black, armored vehicles that devoured the miles of highway with menacing efficiency. Kyle rode with Lena and Elias, the silence inside their vehicle a thick, charged blanket. Lena stared out at the passing landscape of snow-dusted forests, her reflection a ghostly image in the tinted glass. She was no longer wearing the simple training clothes she had grown accustomed to. At Cale's insistence, she had been fitted for formal attire by the pack's master tailor. The result was a gown of deep midnight blue that shimmered like a starless sky, its cut elegant and severe. It was beautiful, but it felt like battle armor, a costume for a role she was not yet sure she could play. Her hair was styled in an intricate braid, and the only jewelry she wore was a simple silver pendant Cale had given her, a polished disc engraved with a stylized wolf howling at the moon, the sigil of his pack. He had placed it around her neck himself, his fingers brushing against her skin, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt of warmth through her entire body. "You are afraid," he had said, not as a question, but as a statement. He stood before her in his own formal attire, a tailored black suit that did little to conceal the raw power of his frame. "I'm terrified," she had admitted, her voice a whisper. "Good," he had replied, his silver eyes intense. "Fear keeps you sharp, but do not let it command you. Remember what Elias taught you. Center yourself. Feel the power that is yours by right of blood. It is older and stronger than any of the petty ambitions you will witness today." Now, as they neared their destination, he spoke again, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. "When we arrive, you will not speak unless I ask you to. You will not react, no matter what provocations are thrown at you. Marcus will try to bait you, to make you seem unstable, emotional, a hysterical human. You will give him nothing. You will be a queen of ice and stone. Your silence will be your shield, and your presence your sword. Lena nodded, her throat too tight to speak. A queen of ice and stone. The words felt like a mockery of the trembling woman she was inside. But as she looked at Kyle, at the unwavering strength in his profile, she found a reservoir of courage she didn't know she had. She would not be the weakness he was accused of harboring. They arrived at a sprawling, ancient lodge, built of massive timbers and river stone, nestled deep within a valley. It was neutral ground, protected by ancient pacts, a place where all alphas could meet without fear of open warfare. But the air was thick with the promise of violence, a low hum of aggression that Lena could now feel, a physical pressure against her skin. Alphas and their retinues from dozens of packs across the continent were already there, gathered in the lodge's great hall. They were a terrifying assembly of power, men and women who radiated an aura of command and predatory stillness. As Kyle, Lena, and Elias entered, a hush fell over the room. Every head turned, every pair of intelligent, feral eyes fixed on them, on her. Lena could feel their gazes like a physical touch, probing, judging. She could smell the complex mix of their scents, a dizzying tapestry of power, curiosity, and hostility. She followed Kale's instructions, keeping her expression impassive, her eyes fixed forward, her head held high. She walked at his side, not behind him, a deliberate statement of her position. They took their designated seats at a massive circular table made from a single petrified tree. And then she saw him. Alpha Marcus was seated directly across from them, a confident, predatory smile playing on his handsome face. He was younger than Kale, with sharp, chiseled features and eyes the color of cold obsidian. He was charisma and cruelty given human form. Beside him, to Lena's shock and disgust, sat Seraphina. She was dressed in a gown of blood red, a triumphant smirk on her beautiful face. Her betrayal was a poisoned knife, not just to Kale, but to her entire pack. She had chosen to side with the enemy, gambling on his victory. Marcus rose to his feet, his presence commanding the room. Brothers, sisters, I thank you for answering this call. We gather today at a precipice. For too long, our people have been led by a king who asks us to blunt our claws, to hide in the shadows, to apologize for the strength our ancestors blessed us with. His voice boomed through the hall, filled with righteous fury. He pointed a dramatic, accusing finger at Kyle. He asks us to make peace with the very creatures who have hunted us for centuries. And as proof of his corrupted philosophy, he brings his human pet into our most sacred assembly. He spat the word pet like a curse. A low murmur rippled through the assembled alphas. Lena felt a hot surge of fury, but she locked it down, her face remaining a mask of cold. Indifference, just as Kale had instructed. She could feel his anger beside her, a tightly leashed inferno. He found this thing, Marcus continued, his eyes raking over Lena with theatrical contempt. Bleeding in the gutter, and instead of letting it die as a nature intended, he elevated it. He has given it a place of honor, allowed it to pollute our home with its human weakness. He has staked the security of our entire nation on the life of this fragile, worthless creature. He paused, letting his words sink in, his dark eyes sweeping over the other alphas. seeking and finding agreement in their hardened faces. I say he is no longer fit to be our king. His judgment is compromised, his bloodline tainted by his association with this human. He turned his venomous gaze fully on Lena. Look at it, cowering behind him. It has no strength, no honor, no wolf. It is a parasite, a disgrace, and I, Marcus, will no longer tolerate a king who embraces such weakness. The hall erupted in a chorus of growls and shouts of agreement. The tide of opinion was turning against them, a powerful, unstoppable wave of aggression. Lena's composure began to crack. The sheer force of their collective hatred was a physical assault. She wanted to scream, to run, to hide, but then she felt Cale's hand cover hers under the table. His touch was firm, steady, a silent command, "Stay calm, trust me." She took a deep, shuddering breath and met Marcus's triumphant, hateful gaze across the table. Her fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it, something else was stirring. A slow, cold, and utterly lethal rage. He had called her worthless. He had called her weak. He was about to find out just how wrong he was. The uproar in the great hall was a physical entity, a wave of sound and fury that crashed against them. Marcus stood at its center, basking in the chaos he had orchestrated, his face alight with triumph. He had successfully painted Cale as a weak leader and Lena as the symbol of that weakness. Seraphina watched from his side, her green eyes glittering with malicious glee, her gaze fixed on Lena, savoring every moment of her perceived humiliation. Kyle remained seated, a bastion of calm in the swirling storm of aggression. He allowed the noise to swell, to reach its crescendo, to exhaust itself. He did not try to shout over them, he simply waited. His stillness was more powerful than any roar. Slowly, as if drawn by his silent, immense authority, the hall quieted. The growls subsided into tense murmurs, and all eyes returned to him, waiting for his defense. Kyle slowly rose to his feet. He did not look at Marcus. He did not look at the other alphas. He looked only at Lena. His silver eyes were calm, but a dangerous fire burned in their depths. "Alpha Marcus is a gifted orator," Kyle began, his voice not loud, but carrying to every corner of the silent hall, each word laced with steel. He paints a compelling picture of weakness and corruption, a picture built entirely on a foundation of lies. He finally turned his gaze on Marcus, a look of such cold contempt that even the arrogant Alpha seemed to flinch. "You speak of strength, Marcus, yet you rely on back-alley assassins and whispered poisons. You speak of honor, yet you ally yourself with traitors." He flicked his eyes toward Seraphina, who paled under his glacial stare. "And you speak of truth," Kyle continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet somehow growing more menacing, "while being blind to the one standing right before you." He gestured not at Lena, but to an empty space beside their table. From the shadows, Elias stepped forward, dragging with him a man in chains. The man was beaten, his face swollen, but his eyes were wide with terror. He was the assassin from the gala. A collective gasp went through the hall. "This coward was hired by Marcus to murder me," Cale announced, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "But his aim was poor. Instead, he shot the woman beside me, a woman he and his master believed to be a fragile human." Marcus's face, which had been a mask of confidence, began to show the first cracks of panic. "Lies! This is a trick! He is trying to deflect from his own failings." Kyle ignored him, his attention now turning to the assembly. Marcus is correct about one thing. I did find Lena bleeding. I did bring her into my home, but he is wrong about her nature. He calls her a weakness. He calls her a parasite. He calls her human. He paused, letting the silence stretch, building the tension to an unbearable point. Then he turned back to Lena, his voice softening, but his command was absolute. Lena, the alphas of our nation are gathered. They have heard the accusations. They have passed their judgment based on ignorance and fear. Now show them the truth. Show them who you are. This was it. The moment her entire new life had been building toward. Every ounce of training, every moment of pain and discovery. Lena rose from her chair, her movements fluid and deliberate. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, feel their doubt, their scorn. She pushed it all away. She closed her eyes for a brief second, centering herself as Elias had taught her. She reached inward, not for the anger Marcus had provoked, but for the quiet, humming core of power that was her birthright. She found the coiled energy of her wolf and did not just tap into it. She opened the floodgates. She opened her eyes. They were no longer the soft brown of a human girl. They were two blazing orbs of liquid gold, shining with an ethereal, predatory light that seemed to suck the very warmth from the room. A collective, involuntary gasp swept through the hall. The alphas leaned forward, their expressions shifting from scorn to disbelief to a dawning primal fear. This was not human. This was something else, something ancient. Lena let the power flow through her, a warm, exhilarating current. She did not need to scream or posture. She let out a low, controlled growl that started deep in her chest. It was not a loud sound, but it was imbued with such raw, untamed power that it vibrated through the floorboards, a clear and undeniable challenge. The sound of a dominant, powerful wolf, but it was her scent that shattered their reality. As her power surged, her scent bloomed in the air, washing over the assembled werewolves. It was not the scent of a common wolf. It was something more, something older. It smelled of moonlight on snow, of ancient forests and ozone, a scent of raw primordial magic that was both terrifying and holy. It was a scent from their oldest legends, a scent none of them had ever encountered in their lifetimes, but one every single one of them knew from the stories passed down through generations. The scent of the lunar guardians, a lost lineage of wolves blessed by the moon itself, thought to be extinct for centuries. The truth, the undeniable sensory truth, slammed into the alphas with the force of a physical blow. They stared at her, their faces a mixture of awe, terror, and profound reverence. She was not a human pet. She was a living myth. Marcus stood frozen, his face ashen, his carefully constructed plan crumbling into dust around him. He stared at Lena's golden eyes, his own dark eyes wide with the horror of his catastrophic miscalculation. He had built his entire rebellion on the lie of her weakness, and that lie had just been incinerated before the entire world. "Impossible," he whispered, the word lost in the stunned silence. Kyle stepped forward, his voice like the tolling of a doom bell. "She is the last of the lunar line, a bloodline you tried to extinguish with a silver bullet, you fool. You did not kill her, you awakened her." The finality in his tone was absolute. The power shift was not gradual, it was instantaneous, a seismic event that reshaped the entire political landscape in a single breathtaking moment. Marcus, seeing his support evaporate, seeing the awe and fury on the faces of the alphas now directed at him, let out a desperate, enraged roar. He lunged, not at Kale, but at Lena, his claws extending, his face contorting in a mask of feral hatred. If he was going down, he would take the source of his ruin with him. But he never reached her. Elias moved like a thunderclap, intercepting him mid-air. Other alphas, once his allies, now surged to their feet, their own fury unleashed, not to help him, but to subdue the blasphemer who had dared to attack a sacred being. The public confrontation was over. Marcus's ruin was absolute, and Lena's ascension had just begun. The aftermath of the conclave was swift and brutal. Marcus was not killed. Kyle decreed a punishment he deemed far more fitting for a creature of such immense pride. He was stripped of his title, his power, his very name within their society. His pack was absorbed under the leadership of his more level-headed beta, and Marcus himself was collared with a silver-laced restraint that suppressed his ability to shift, rendering him little more than a powerful human. He was exiled, cast out into the human world he so despised, a wolf in a cage of his own skin, doomed to live as the fragile creature he had mocked. His ruin was total, a public spectacle of humiliation that would serve as a warning for generations. Seraphina's fate was equally stark. Her treachery was laid bare for all to see. Kyle, in a voice cold enough to freeze fire, declared her persona non grata. She was cast out from their pack, her name struck from their history. She who had dreamed of being a queen was now an outcast, a lone wolf with no territory and no allies, forced to beg for scraps at the edges of a society that now viewed her with nothing but contempt. She left the great hall without a word, her beautiful face a twisted mask of hatred and disbelief, her future a bleak and lonely wasteland. The great hall, once a cauldron of hostility, was now a hall of worship. The alphas who had been swayed by Marcus's rhetoric now approached Kale and Lena with their heads bowed, their voices filled with reverence. They pledged their fealty not just to their king, but to the living legend at his side. Lena stood beside Kyle, the golden light in her eyes having receded, but the power still thrumming just beneath her skin. She was no longer Lena, the waitress. She was Lena of the Lunar Guardians, a name that echoed with the weight of prophecy and power. She accepted their pledges with a quiet grace she hadn't known she possessed, the queen of ice and stone that Kale had asked her to be. The journey back to the Citadel was the complete opposite of their departure. The air was not thick with tension, but with a new, profound sense of peace and rightness. The world had been thrown off its axis, and now it had settled back into a new, more powerful alignment. Lena and Kale stood once more in his study, the snow falling heavily outside the window, blanketing the world in a soft white silence. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, dancing light on their faces. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The events of the day felt both surreal and inevitable. "They look at me like I'm some kind of goddess," Lena said softly, breaking the silence. She wrapped her arms around herself, the memory of their awestruck, fearful faces still vivid in her mind. "They fear you," Kyle corrected gently, "and they revere you, as they should. You are a link to our most ancient past and the key to our future. What you are is a power this world has not seen in 1,000 years." He stepped closer to her, his immense presence a source of comfort now, not intimidation. "I asked you to be a queen of ice and stone today, Lena, and you were. You were magnificent." He reached out, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw. "But I never want you to forget the woman who threw herself in front of a bullet for a stranger, the woman with a heart so courageous it awakened a sleeping legend. That is who you are. The power is a part of you, but it is not all of you. His thumb brushed across her lower lip, and the gentle touch sent a tremor through her. The connection between them, the unspoken bond that had been forged in violence and tempered in loyalty, was now an undeniable, powerful force. It was more than gratitude, more than a king's duty to his charge. It was something deeper, something fated. "What happens now?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Now," he said, his silver eyes searching hers, "we prepare. Marcus was a symptom of a larger disease. There are others who share his beliefs, who will see your existence not as a miracle, but as a threat. They will come for you." The thought should have terrified her, but it didn't. She was not the same woman who had been afraid of Seraphina's insults. She had faced down a room full of alphas and brought them to their knees with a look and a growl. She had a home, she had a pack, she had a king who believed in her. "Let them come," she said, and the words were not a boast, but a simple, cold statement of fact. A ghost of a smile touched Cale's lips. That is the spirit of a queen. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, his eyes closing as he breathed her in. "You are no longer my charge, Lena of the Lunar Guardians. You are my partner, my equal, and if you will have me, you are my mate." The word hung in the air between them, filled with 1,000 years of meaning. It was not a proposal born of politics or convenience. It was a declaration of absolute truth, a recognition of a bond that had been sealed in that single, selfless act in a crowded ballroom. It was the final piece of the puzzle of her new life slotting into place. She was not a stray, she was not a pet, she was not a human, she was a wolf, a guardian, a queen, and she was finally, truly, home. Looking into his silver eyes, she saw her future, a future filled with danger and power, with duty and destiny. And for the first time in her life, she was not afraid. She had found the place where she belonged. She leaned in and sealed his declaration with a kiss, a promise made not in words, but in the silent language of two souls recognizing their other half. The waitress was gone forever, and in her place a legend had risen,